introduce my panel here. So starting with next to me, we have Rear Admiral retired Mike Studeman. Mike's a senior fellow with the Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy. He's also got a long distinguished career in the U.S. Navy. He was the commander of the Office of Naval Intelligence, as well as an intel director for two combatant commands, Indo-PACOM and Southcom, here just down the street. We also then have Juan Pablo Toro. Juan Pablo is a senior fellow at the Chilean think tank AthenaLab, as well as the Royal United Services Institute in London. He's worked with us on a number of Latin American Caribbean conferences, to include last year's HSC. And he just recently published some papers on Chinese dual-use maritime capabilities, as well as undersea cable strategy. And then on the end, we have Gregg Casad. Gregg is the monitoring, control, and surveillance advisor to Skylight, where he supports governments and conservation partners, strengthening maritime domain awareness and enforcement capacity. He's a veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard, where, again, he's began and has been working on illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing for a long time now. So, again, we'll get into to hear from the panelists here and jump into the actual panel, which is entitled Maritime Security Reimagined, Navigating New Threats at Sea. So, again, the illicit trafficking, a lot of what we've looked at historically is drug trafficking in particular. Certainly other maritime crime, piracy, arms smuggling, human trafficking, and migrant trafficking has been significant also. But I'd argue with what we're going to say here and hopefully describe, some of the changes are that the maritime domain is not just the transit zone. It's a contested strategic area in which competition is increasingly under the level of armed conflict. And some examples of these are the IUU fishing, port acquisitions, which again were covered a lot in the infrastructure panel earlier, but dual-use maritime capabilities and infrastructure, and then vulnerabilities to communications and infrastructure and undersea cables. So I'd like to start off with Mike and to see, could you frame for us the current environment and what concerns you most about that?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Honored to be here, and I'm proud to be a newly minted senior fellow at FIU. I hope I live up to my responsibilities, and it's an honor to be here with Juan Pablo and Gregg. I prefer to do things macro to micro and kind of look at the big strategic movements and trends first. So if you'd permit me, I would just say the way I think about the maritime environment today and some of the changes that are underway, one, there's a change in awareness. Secondly, a change in the number of apertures, sensors that are out there in the maritime domain. And the third piece is AI. So I have like sort of triple A thing here with the awareness, the apertures, and AI. And so it's very clear to me that most people in the world today have awoken to the value of the maritime domain. This was not always the case. We have taken the maritime domain for granted for too long. In the Navy, we would call this sea blindness, right? And I believe that the scales have kind of fallen from many people's eyes who didn't know how important the maritime domain was to their lives. And I think that the Ukraine war was kind of one of the first kind of big epiphanies that people had when they had the interrupted energy supplies, grain supplies that feed the world, right? And so that's persisted since 2022. And then this strange group called the Houthis, right, in Yemen, you wouldn't think that they would affect your personal lives, but then, ships were avoiding the Red Sea for all the attacks that were taking place and going all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and rising prices associated with their transit fees. And then, of course, you had the Iran war here recently, still unresolved, and the impact on your personal lives from pumping gas to prices in the stores. And so I do believe, finally, we've had kind of this awareness as to how the maritime domain and what happens there, how that is interrupted can affect us. And I think the main point to talk about is not necessarily, people want to talk about the fragility of all this. They say things are so tightly wired, right? The just-in-time delivery, that when that's interrupted, we feel it. And I think there's a better word for this, and that's the leverageability of the maritime domain, where you can have small, seemingly distant actors suddenly transform their capability to use a weapon of mass disruption and to have global effects, right? And so the leverageability in Latin America obviously relates to, how your transnational criminal organizations are able to hide in the noise and the static and still have a pathway to be able to conduct their business. And the same is true of sort of the dark, shadow fleets that you've heard about now, that I've known about for almost all of my career, that frankly are getting, the right kind of attention now. Not just observing them, but actually doing something about them. So that's the A word on awareness, and I think we've changed for the good. Secondly, when I think about the apertures, I mean, there's a sea change with regard to how many sensors are out there now. We're not just talking about drones, but clearly is going to be a massive influx of drones in all of the warfare domains. But in the maritime spaces, it's changing through the nature of what you see and how quickly you can see it with different phenomenologies. And there's that. You have the Southcom's establishment of their Autonomous Warfare Command, which is designed solely to bring more autonomous, assets and drones into the Southcom AOR. That will bring more apertures or sensors as well. But we're talking about the realization with regard to what commercial imagery, geospatial imagery now gives from space. It could be radar, it could be EO, it could be any number of signals detectors for AIS. But today what you can actually get from a variety of different sources is revolutionary in terms of illuminating and lightening up areas that had been dark for too long, which all sorts of actors, nation state and transnational, have been using. And then the final area of artificial intelligence is truly a game changer there as well, because in order for you to be able to use your limited assets with economy, you're going to have to operate with speed and at scale to understand what you can go after, when you can go after it, and have the highest impact. And artificial intelligence, we're starting to harness it, is now giving us an ability to do what I spent years of my life doing in a very slow, primitive fashion, which is all source fusion, almost manually. It got more automated over time, but it's nothing compared to the speed with which artificial intelligence now can actually fuse all these different sources. And we're talking about not just the traditional ones that you would say is ISR. We're talking about social media and being able to scrape social media very quickly. So we're talking about the ability to pick up on digital signatures and being able to make sense of those things in a more timely way in ways humans couldn't. And to me, as we take a look at our ability to do things in the maritime domain for protection and our security, that these trends leading all the way up to artificial intelligence will enable us to actually do more with less. And so I think that's going to be a path that we're on. I believe that artificial intelligence is not yet ready to give us a God's eye view of the maritime space and the people and the processes and the infrastructure and all the rest inside of it. But we need to steadily work towards being able to tap into more data sources and be able to do better fusion as we go along. So the AAA framework for me is a way to think about the major trends in the maritime space.
Great, thank you, Mike. I'd like to then, with Juan Pablo, kind of, as we look big picture and get a little more narrow and look at the undersea cables, and based on your recent paper, if you highlight some of the key findings from that and the most concerning parts about China's undersea cable strategy.
Well, thanks for having me here, Bruce, again, and to the FIU. And so you mentioned, we recently published a paper along with my friend Martin Brown. It's over here. He's a young, talented researcher here at the FIU. Undersea cables. I don't want to go so technical on this issue, but to understand the importance of undersea cables, between 99 or 95% of the world data goes through undersea cables. So this is why the undersea cables represent the nervous systems of the world economy and the world communications. These communications include from military intelligence to financial transactions. So this is why are so important. If you see the map of Latin America especially, most of the countries of Latin America, with the exception of Brazil, connect themselves to the world using US cables. So recently, China, in the framework of the Digital Silk Road Initiative, is offering through companies as HMN Tech, former Huawei Maritime Network, and China Mobile is offering right now different projects to different countries in Latin America to develop connections between these countries to China, or to develop cables to connect different countries inside the region. One example is Guyana-Suriname system. So this is a kind of new initiative. Of course, most of the countries are interested in to develop or to increase their connections with the world, because in this digital economy these days, if you have better connections and more connections, of course, your economy is going to do a better job. No? I mean, to increase, to open new business with different markets. But as the Professor Mearsheimer described early in the morning, we live in a multipolar world with three big powers, US, China, and Russia, basically redrawing or creating sphere of influences in the world. And these spheres of influence implies political level, economic level, military level, and of course, technological level. And in the case of our research, basically, when we discovered when the countries are looking for increase their connection with the world through cables, they need to understand the world picture of the strategic consequences when the countries choose a provider. Because in the case of Chinese company, you need to understand who is the final owner, or if these companies are aligned with the national objectives of the Chinese regime. Especially because there's a law from the 2017, a cybersecurity law in China, basically that create an obligation to private companies to share data with the intelligence agencies. And if you connect your country with China using a Chinese company, or you choose a Chinese provider, there's a high probability that your data, your national data, you are going to put your national data in hands of finally in the Chinese state. And you need to understand that. And it's not easy for a country to understand that, because I think in Latin America and in the Caribbean, we don't have a strategic culture. Basically, we are still thinking on just business. Yeah? So if a Chinese provider offers me basically the cheapest offer, I'm going to choose that offer compared with different projects from different companies from Europe or from the US. So I think we need to change our mindset. And of course, when we think in terms of maritime security, as the Admiral described it, we've been focused in the recent decades basically in Western Hemisphere waters, in drug trafficking and in illegal fishing in the recent years. But we need to understand what is the importance of what we have basically beneath the sea. I mean, and cables are especially important these days because we discovered, if we see what is going on inside the world, you mentioned the Houthis. The Houthis is a non-state actor that attack cables using explosives in a very simple way, but in a very effective way to create disruptions. Of course, we've been watching what is going on in the Baltic, and around Taiwan waters. So revisionist powers are very focused in undersea cables in order to create disruptions, but in order to gathering data for cables. So recently in Chile, I don't know if you are following with the story, Chile decided to block a project to a company, a China mobile company, basically is insisting to create a connection between Chile and China. A few years ago, so we decided to reject this project, and basically we choose Google as a company to create, basically to lay a cable between Chile and Asia using Australia as an outpost. But the Chinese company insists in this new project, and we need to understand why they are so persistent. Because Chile is a 20 million country. It's not the biggest economy in the region. But basically, we need to understand that basically Chile is not the main objective. We need to understand that China wants to develop their own connections to the regions, because if I send a message, you say in my phone or my computer, an email to China, this message goes through the US and then to China. So China wants to develop their own connections to not pass through the US. So this is the first objective in all the persistent attitude of China to promote their own cable systems in Latin America. Second of all, of course, using Chile, the Chinese want to access to the Brazilian data market. And this is really the final goal. And of course, they want to access to Argentina through Chile. And finally, I think there's a lot of interest of China to basically to one day access to all the data that is generated in Antarctica. And Chile is studying, and right now there's a project to connect the continental American Chile with the Chilean Antarctica through a cable. So if one day we conquer this project, China could access to the data to Antarctica in an easy way between these two cables. The one connect China with South America and the one that connect Chile with the Antarctica one day. But this represents a serious challenge, especially to the Monroe Doctrine. And Professor Mersheimie recommend that it's not very smart to challenge the Monroe Doctrine this day. We learn in Chile in the hard way, because in the case of the cable issue, basically the State Department announced that they are revoking visas to one minister of the last administration of Chile, the Boric government, and two other officials, because they are creating a risk to the regional security, because the last government authorized the Chinese cable. But they say that it was just a project. But the government was discovered, the Boric government was basically hiding information. But fortunately, we are not to allow this Chinese company to lay a cable between Chile and China. And just in order to finish, other concern that we discovered, and it's very important, that there are some countries that basically are accepting these offers from Chinese companies to lay cables, undersea cables, but also they are part of the Smart Cities project developed by Huawei company, and also they are using Chinese equipment for surveillance. So if you connect surveillance with the Smart City projects and cables, that's allowed vertical integration to gather your intel and your national data. So this is part of our findings.
Thanks. I have questions for both of you, but I want to make sure we get Gregg to talk here. Gregg, so illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing can be complicated beyond just the name. But can you kind of talk to us about the challenges of governance of IUU fishing?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. And first, I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you to FIU and to the sponsors of this event. I've been fortunate enough to be coming for a couple of years to talk about IUU fishing, and it's an absolute pleasure to be on the stage with these gentlemen and yourself, Bruce. I want to talk about IUU fishing. So just kind of like, what's my perspective? Where do I fit into this? I'm a Coast Guard guy. I come from a maritime security background, but I work at this intersection between maritime security, the conservation community, and then technology. And that's the group that I'm here working with is Skylight, which is a product that comes out of the Allen Institute of Artificial Intelligence. And I will happily talk with anybody on the side about Skylight, but I'm not going to talk about Skylight during this presentation today. What I want to talk about is 3 points. The first with IUU. We talk a lot about the I piece of IUU. We talk a lot about the illegal piece. That's that vessel entering in, it's a vessel using the wrong gear, perhaps fishing out of season, those type of illegal issues, oftentimes tied to sovereignty. As we looked at the dashboard earlier and we talk about vessels being inside of Argentina or Peru's waters, those are sovereignty issues. And that's why people rightfully focus on it. But I will tell you that I think that the community focusing on the U and the U, and that being the unreported and the unregulated. Now, I will say, unregulated, outside the blue hole off of Argentina, there aren't a lot of places left that are unregulated. Perhaps underregulated, but not where there isn't some level of governance or some type of law in place. The unreported is the place where, for me, I get a lot of concerns. You cannot manage what you do not know. If I do not know how reproductive my fish stocks are, if I do not know how much catch is being taken out of it, there is absolutely no way that I can be successful in managing that fishery. So I would just encourage, as people think about this issue, don't just focus on the I piece, but also looking at how do we build that institutional capacity within these countries, within the region, across the globe, to address the unreported aspects of it and understanding our fish stocks. Because these fish stocks are public trust resources. So we can't lose sight of this. These resources should be for your country. They should be for your protein. They should be for your economy. They should be for your coastal communities. And if we do it right, it will last in perpetuity. It can, but we have to do it right. So just keeping that concept in mind associated with it. Now, I promise, Bruce, I'll pick up my pace. I'm not fast. I'm not a fast speaker, but one of the things I want for this community, the security community, to recognize, coming from a security background, I always thought of environmental groups, and I had a certain perspective associated with where they were coming from. And what I want folks in this room who work in the security side to know is there are nonprofits that are working in this space that are natural partners for you. We are working with the governments to develop this persistent presence piece, being able to understand what is going on in your waters, being able to build the capabilities and the capacity within the country to be able to monitor their waters and then also monitor their fleets. And one example I'll give you is just in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, underneath the CMAR project, working with Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, and Costa Rica, there is a project underway that was funded by the Bezos Earth Fund that is supporting the establishment of command centers, looking at these fisheries monitoring centers, developing the skills within as analysts, but also for law enforcement officers, fisheries officers, and prosecutors, and press. How do you push this out? How do you actually talk about these issues and have that resonate with the public? So there are partners out there that maybe you don't know about. And so what I would offer to you, the security community, is please be open to us. Be open to talking with us and sharing information. You have a lot of lessons learned, you've spent a lot of time and effort and capital learning some of those lessons. It would be fantastic for those to be shared with us. And then the final point, and the Admiral already made this point very eloquently, so I will be very brief with it. Within the environmental community, when we talk about ocean governance, the talk right now is about the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, or BB&J. That is the topic du jour. And what I will say to you is, I asked ChatGPT, just to use a little bit of AI, I asked ChatGPT when I was sitting over there earlier this afternoon, and I said, what is the size of the EEZs in the Western Hemisphere? And it came back with 15 million square miles. I don't know if that's right or not, but I can guarantee you it's pretty close, and that's a lot of water. And from my perspective, and when we start talking about BB&J and trying to do things on the high seas, those waters beyond national jurisdiction, boy, oh boy, the ability to use satellites to be able to detect and be able to identify, and that's where the Skylight, and this is my only pitch I'll make for it, this is where we're working on. We're working on taking that information from publicly available satellites, from commercial satellites, taking that and turning it into information that comes in a near real-time fashion. When I say that, I'm talking some of our events come through in the matter of minutes. Some of them come through the satellite data we're talking about within hours. And we're putting that information in front of analysts so they can make decisions on how they allocate resources. So again, there's a community out there in the nonprofit sector. We're coming at it from a different angle, but we have similar goals and objectives.
Thanks, Gregg. Again, we only have a minute or so left here, but we'll do a quick lightning round here. And so going back to you, Mike, in terms of technology or policy cooperation, how do we get more upstream and ahead of some of the problem?
Yeah, I do think that the technology, if we do it right, is going to enable us to do what we're going to need to do, keeping in mind that our adversaries are also using that technology, and whether they're hiding or they're exploiting, this is going to be a battle of who uses it best. And in my view, whether you're talking about a TCO or nation states, they've all benefited from us being very fragmented. We've heard that theme before in this conference. And so the question is whether or not we're going to trust each other and trust each other with the right kind of data so that can be aggregated. So today you have a few data streams that have been braided together, and maybe that's occurred within a certain number of silos, but we're going to have to get really good at this idea of what interagency, whole of government, looks like in terms of sharing data. We're talking about, Coast Guard, fishery agencies, port authorities, our internal investigative capability, our financial, crimes units, et cetera. Like, how are they going to actually share the right kind of data? Because the clues are in there. You may not think so, but they are, and we're proving it out. And so we need to be able to actually essentially intertwine more of these data streams together. We need to have policies that allow us to do this. And we need to have the trust, I think, when we work it well intrastate, that we're going to have to figure out what the interstate corollary of that looks like. Because these are threats that are obviously crossing borders, are multinational by their very nature. And so how do we actually have the trust to be able to combine forces when it comes to the data that we get? Today, I believe we're on a data hilltop, but I don't think we actually have a stratospheric view of the problem set. And we're going to need to slowly but surely build out a data ocean from a data lake, from a data stream, to be able to actually enable us to do as much as our tools really could potentially empower us. And I think without that, with adversaries using these same tools, then you'll find that they'll continue to find avenues to do what they do, and we won't be able to win the competition there.
Great, thanks. And Gregg, I'd like to go back over to you and then finish Juan Pablo with the final word. So there is some level of cooperation on different things with drug trafficking and in other areas. What's hindering that same cooperation in terms of IUU fishing? Is it legal political, cultural? What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. We heard a little bit of this from the infrastructure group earlier, talking about governance and some of the themes we've heard from the various speakers today, where you have agencies that don't talk to each other. And that is absolutely the case with fisheries. And we can only, I think the Admiral used the word that I love to use when I'm talking about this, we can only operate at the speed of trust. And in an unfortunate situation, in a lot of places, there is a lack of trust between the Fisheries Administration, the Ministry of the Environment, and the National Defense. Some of those are well-earned, and well-earned may not be the right term, but hopefully you understand what I mean. There's good reason for you to have some potential issues there. So you have to break that down, and you have to then figure out how do you get to the point where you're making decisions as the whole of government. So we have a response where if we have an illegal fishing vessel that's engaged in a country's water, it isn't the Coast Guard taking an action. It's the government of Argentina. And for those of you who haven't been watching, there's a recent case that the government, and I want to, I don't know if any of the Argentine friends are still in the room, Argentina is doing some very innovative things on how they're using law to deal with illegal fishing. I don't have time to get into it today. I encourage everybody, do a quick search on Google and you'll find this recent case where they are in the process of some legal proceedings addressing some illegal fishing that happens there in the Blue Hole. So it is this piece. We do have lessons to learn. There has been a lot of lessons learned on the security side that should be transferred to the environmental side as well.
Thanks, Gregg. And again, Juan and Pablo, the last minute here. What cooperation recommendations would you say, like how do we address the problem you described with the undersea cable vulnerabilities?
Well, in terms of cooperation, I mean, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, I think we need to develop screening investment mechanisms. Most of the country of Latin America, we don't have these kind of mechanisms. Could be a committee, so you can share the CFIUS experience to many countries in Latin America, or could be regulations. But we need to start or create a cooperation and develop these mechanisms to cover this issue of the undersea cables, but another kind of strategic technologies. Second, I think the DFC can play a role here, providing aid or loans to develop projects across the region in terms of increasing connectivity with new undersea cable systems. I hope the DFC plays a role because it fits with the new national security strategy in order to develop or provide clean networks. Maybe you remember the clean network concept for the last Trump administration. And finally, in terms of security and defense of cybersecurity, I think we could include cable protection in our regular naval exercises as UNITAS or different kind of exercises of operation across the region. I think during the last year, as I mentioned, we are very focused on illegal fishing. That is good and important, of course, and drug trafficking, but we need to move forward and include protection of cables or undersea cables in this competitive multipolar world that is more dangerous, as Professor Mersheimer mentioned.
Great. Thanks. Unfortunately, we're over time now. But again, thank you to the panelists, Mike, Juan Pablo, Gregg. Again, hopefully shed some light on some of the threats that are out there in the maritime domain and build upon what we talked about earlier in the conference too. But if you give me a round of applause for the panel, I appreciate it.
Well done. Thank you.
Very nice to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you.